Pregnant teen mysteriously disappears. Crime Watch investigation uncovers shocking truth. A hook. What happened to a pregnant teen who vanished without a trace? In this spine-chilling investigation, the truth is more terrifying than you could ever imagine. Stay tuned as we uncover the dark secrets hidden deep within the woods and the shocking twists that no one saw coming. Don't blink, or you might miss the one clue that changes everything. This hook is designed to pull viewers in with a sense of mystery, suspense, and promise of a surprising revelation that will keep them engaged until the end. The sun had already set, casting an eerie glow over the sleepy town. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A young girl, barely 17, walked down the empty road. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound sharp against the stillness. Her name was Emily, and she was carrying something precious, a secret. Her belly swelled with new life. Though she was alone, she had told no one. The world had closed its doors to her, leaving her to fend for herself. She glanced around, every rustling leaf sounding louder than before. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Something fell off. The street seemed darker now, colder. The trees swayed gently, their branches scraping the sky like clawed hands. Suddenly a noise, a soft whisper. She froze, eyes darting around. Nothing, just the wind. She quickened her pace, her heart thudding in her chest. Then, the creak of a door. She turned her head sharply, but saw nothing. A chill ran up her spine. She stumbled, the ground beneath her feet feeling uneven, unfamiliar. Her pulse raced. Why was she here? Why did she feel like something was watching her? A flicker of movement ahead, a shadow in the alleyway. She squinted, trying to make out the shape. Nothing. She kept walking, faster now. The sound of her footsteps became deafening. With each step, the whispering wind grew louder. Something was following her. Her breathing quickened, panicked. She reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling. Her phone. No signal. Her stomach tightened. She was alone. The alley ahead grew darker. The shadows seemed to shift, closing in. Her body tensed as she approached the entrance. Then she heard it. A soft voice. It wasn't the wind. Emily, her name. She spun around, eyes wide. No one. Just the empty street. Emily. The voice again, closer this time. She backed up, her heart pounding in her ears. The alley seemed to stretch further, darker. Her feet moved faster now, but the voice kept calling. Closer. And then, a hand grabbed her. Cold fingers dug into her arm, pulling her back. She screamed, but no sound escaped. A figure loomed over her, dark and indistinct. Her vision blurred, a harsh breath against her ear. The last thing she felt before everything went black. Silence. When they found her, hours later, the only trace left of Emily was her purse. It sat untouched at the end of the alley. The phone was gone, and Emily vanished without a trace. The town was thrown into chaos. No one knew where Emily had gone. Her parents, frantic, scoured the streets, calling her name. Neighbors joined in the search, combing through every corner of the town. But there was nothing, no sign of her, no trace of the baby she carried. The only clue was the purse. The police took it in for questioning. They found nothing inside, just an old receipt and a crumpled napkin. The alley where Emily disappeared remained sealed off. Investigators couldn't make sense of it. No fingerprints, no evidence of a struggle. The only thing they could confirm, Emily was gone. Days passed. The search continued, but hope began to fade. No leads, no witnesses, and then a strange discovery. A local fisherman found something in the woods near the river. It was a phone, but it wasn't Emily's. It was a shattered piece of another device. He called the police. thinking it was just another piece of trash. When the forensics team examined it, they found something unexpected. A message burned into the screen. It wasn't a text. It was a location, a hidden place in the woods. The coordinates were accurate, pointing to a spot far from any path. The search shifted to the woods, and when they arrived at the location, they found something even more chilling, an old, abandoned cabin. The door was cracked open. Darkness lingered inside, like a wound in the world. They entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through the blackness. And there, in the center of the room, a single, dusty crib. Empty. The faint smell of dampness hung in the air. It was quiet, too quiet. But then they heard something, a faint cry. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper. The searchers stopped, hearts racing. They followed the sound. It led them to the back of the cabin. There, on the floor, was a bundle of cloth. They reached for it, hands shaking. Inside was a small, lifeless baby doll. It wasn't Emily's child, but it looked like her. The face of the doll was an uncanny replica. Everything about it was wrong. The silence grew heavy, thick, suffocating. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. What had happened to Emily? Where was she? And what did this doll mean? Questions swirled, but answers remained elusive. The officers gathered around the doll, their flashlights trembling. It sat there lifeless, a grotesque reminder of the mystery they were up against. Who would leave this here, and why? They inspected the cabin further, each creak of the wooden floorboard sending a jolt through their nerves. There was nothing else. No sign of Emily, no hint of where she had gone or what had happened to her. But something didn't sit right. Something about the doll, the way it seemed too perfect, too deliberate. They returned to the crib. It was old, covered in dust, but its wood was smooth, untouched by time. There was no way Emily could have placed it there. It was as if it had been waiting. The air grew heavier with each passing minute. The darkness in the cabin seemed to grow, wrapping itself around them. And then, a sound. The faintest shuffle just behind them. They turned in unison, eyes wide, searching the shadows. Nothing. No one. Just the silence that swallowed the cabin hull. But the feeling lingered. Something was wrong. Something watched them from the corner of the room. One of the officers stepped forward, his hand gripping his flashlight tighter. "Let's check the basement," he said, his voice steady but edged with unease. They descended slowly, the stairs groaning beneath their weight. At the bottom, the air was thick, damp, a faint smell of mildew mixed with something else. Something metallic. They shone their lights around, revealing old furniture, dusty boxes. And in the far corner, a door, half open, as if waiting for them. The officers exchanged looks before they approached it. The door creaked as it swung wide. Behind it was a small, cramped room, and in the center of that room, another crib, empty. And then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she whispered, "Help me." Before they could react, the room spun violently. The walls seemed to close in on them, and then nothing. The officers woke up in the hallway. The cabin was silent again, empty. The door to Emily's room had disappeared. The crib was gone, and when they checked their radios, there was nothing, no signal, just the sound of static. They left the cabin, but they couldn't shake the feeling that it had followed them. The shadows, the whispers, and the chilling thought that Emily was still waiting. The air outside felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. The officers walked away from the cabin, but the darkness seemed to cling to them. Every step they took felt like it was pulling them back. The trees loomed tall, their branches twisting above them like dark fingers reaching for the sky. The road ahead seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the night. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. Every rustle of leaves made their skin crawl. Every creak of the forest felt like it was closing in. They quickened their pace, but the whispers came again, faint at first, then louder. They spun around, their flashlights darting through the trees. Nothing, just the oppressive silence. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. The other nodded, his grip on his weapon tight. They kept moving, but the whispers followed. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of something unseen was pressing down on them. And then, ahead, something appeared in the distance. A figure, standing motionless by the side of the road. They froze. The figure was shrouded in darkness, barely distinguishable from the night. But as they drew closer, they could see it more clearly. It was Emily, but she was different. Her eyes were wide open, but they were dark, black voids, empty of all life. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. She didn't move, just stood there, her body stiff, as if she was waiting. The officers called her name, but she didn't respond. Her gaze never wavered. It was as if she was trapped in some kind of trance. One of the officers stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Emily?" A low, guttural sound escaped from her throat. The officer recoiled, his breath catching in his chest. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile, something that didn't belong. And then she whispered, "Help me, help us." Before they could react, Emily's body jerked violently, her limbs twisting in unnatural angles. The officers backed away, panic rising in their chests. But before they could run, something dragged them to the ground, cold hands invisible, tightening around their ankles. They tried to scream, but their mouths were sealed shut. The ground beneath them began to shift, as if something was moving below, something alive. And from the earth, the whispers grew louder. "Join us." Forever? The officers' eyes darted wildly, but it was too late. The ground swallowed them whole, pulling them into the earth with a suffocating force. The forest went still again, but the whispers lingered, echoing through the trees, fading into the night. And Emily stood there, her body still, her eyes empty, waiting. For the next soul to come, the forest was silent again, but there was a heaviness in the air, as if something still lingered, watching. Emily's figure stood motionless, her dark eyes fixed on the spot where the officers had vanished. The wind whispered through the trees, but it sounded different now, darker, as though carrying a secret too heavy to be spoken aloud. The ground where they had been swallowed was smooth again, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet the air was thick with a presence, a force that pressed down on the world around it, making everything feel wrong. And Emily was still there, her body now a hollow shell. The longer she stood in the clearing, the more the shadows seemed to bend toward her, like they were drawn to her emptiness. A soft, almost inaudible voice floated on the wind. "Help us." It wasn't Emily's voice. It was something else, something older, something that had been here long before her, and it would be here long after. Behind her, deep in the woods, something moved. A figure, half seen, half felt. It was a shadow, a flicker of motion, too fast to be truly seen. The air seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. And then, the earth itself seemed to breathe, shifting beneath Emily's feet. A low rumble echoed through the ground, reverberating in the air, like some ancient force awakening from a long slumber. Emily's head tilted slightly to the side. Her mouth barely moved, but her voice, it was not her voice. "Join us, be part of the shadows." The words carried a strange, irresistible pull. Her eyes, black and empty, locked onto the clearing ahead, and for a moment, just a moment, the world seemed to stand still. And then, without warning, she turned. Her body moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding rather than walking, as though gravity itself had lost its hold on her. She moved toward the edge of the woods, toward the place where the officers had disappeared, and the ground trembled beneath her. The whispers followed, not from the wind anymore, but from the earth. They spoke in a language too ancient to understand, too twisted to recognize. The shadows in the woods stretched further now, reaching out to her. Emily was no longer just a girl lost in the woods. She was part of something else, part of something old, something dark, something that had waited for centuries to be reborn. As she walked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the darkness thicker. The whispers became louder, and then she stopped. For the first time since her disappearance, she seemed to hesitate, as if something was pulling her back, something she couldn't escape. The shadows closed in around her, and the whispers grew frantic. "Join us forever." Emily's hands trembled slightly, her face, still vacant, turned up to the sky. A sudden breeze swirled around her, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. And then everything went quiet. The shadows were gone. The whispers faded into nothingness, and the forest stood still, as if it had never been disturbed. But Emily was gone, and the woods were empty. The only trace left behind was a single footprint, a footprint that led nowhere. The woods stood silent, almost serene, as though nothing had ever happened. But the emptiness was deceptive. Beneath the surface, the air still carried a weight, an unspoken tension, a quiet terror that lingered in the stillness. The moon above cast a pale light over the clearing where Emily had vanished, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, as though they were reaching for something just out of sight. But no one was there, no one except the forest, and the lingering whispers that no one could quite hear, but could feel deep within their bones. As the days passed, the search for Emily died down. Her name became another forgotten rumor in a town that had already moved on. But for those who still listened carefully, for those who lingered too long near the edge of the woods, the stories never truly ended. In the dead of night, some claimed to hear the faint sound of footsteps on the edge of the forest, the soft crunch of leaves beneath slow-moving feet. Others spoke of seeing shadows moving in the corners of their eyes, darting through the trees just outside the reach of the light. The most chilling reports, though, came from the few who had ventured too close to the cabin that abandoned, decaying building hidden deep in the woods. They said that sometimes when the wind was just right, you could hear something, a voice, a whisper, faint at first, but growing clearer the closer you got. "Help me. Join us." But the voice didn't belong to Emily anymore. It wasn't her. It wasn't anyone who had ever been alive. It was something else. And anyone who heard it, well, they never came back. The forest, it seemed, had claimed them. It had claimed everyone who had come searching for Emily. And soon enough, the town itself began to feel the weight of the curse, a creeping cold that settled in the streets, in the houses, in the very walls. Those who lived there began to speak of strange dreams, of dark figures standing at the foot of their beds, whispering in tongues they didn't understand, and the feeling of eyes watching them from the shadows. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was everywhere. People began to disappear. One by one, they vanished without a trace. The town grew quieter, emptier. And then, one fateful night, when the moon was full and the wind howled through the trees, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't just in the forest. They were in the streets, in the houses, in the hearts of every soul left in that cursed place. The town was falling apart. The shadows were everywhere, and there was no escaping the thing that had taken Emily. It had been waiting for so long, and now it was ready to claim everyone, forever. The town was no longer the place it once was. It was quieter, darker, like the life had been drained from it. Streets that used to be filled with laughter were empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement in the corners of eyes, shadows that shouldn't be there. No one dared speak of Emily anymore, but they all felt it. The presence. The creeping unease that settled like dust in their homes. It was in the air, heavy with the unspoken fear that someone, someday, would be next. In the dead of night, the whispers would return, soft at first, then louder, as if more and more voices joined in. It was as if the town itself had become a part of something darker, something ancient. No one was immune. People started to act strangely, walking the streets with vacant eyes, speaking in hushed tones, as though something was always just behind them. The town had become a shadow of itself. But the worst part was that they didn't know how to stop it. The town's officials tried to contain the growing madness. They brought in experts, investigators, even spiritualists, but no one could understand the curse that had fallen over them. Everyone had their theories. Some said it was a consequence of Emily's disappearance, that her spirit had been consumed by the forest and, in turn, had begun to consume everyone else. Others spoke of a darker, more malevolent force, something not of this world, that had always existed in the woods, waiting for the right moment to break free. But the most terrifying thought was the one that began to creep into the minds of the remaining residents. What if Emily wasn't the only one who had been claimed? What if the town itself was being consumed, piece by piece? It wasn't until the strange occurrences began to escalate that they realized the truth. A child, playing in their backyard, had seen something. A glimpse of a figure, pale, twisted, unrecognizable, moving between the trees. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't anyone they had known. It was something else, something far worse. And it was no longer confined to the woods. It was inside the town. It had taken root. One by one, people began to disappear again. But this time, there was no trace left behind. No clues. Nothing. Just the faintest echo of whispers in the wind. Join us. Forever? The town was empty now. Only the wind carried the stories of the lost. Only the shadows remembered. And in the deepest, darkest part of the forest, the whispers still called. They called for anyone who would listen, to join the endless darkness, to become one with the shadows. Forever the town was forgotten by the world, swallowed up by the encroaching wilderness that had once stood at its edge. It had become a place of no return, where those who had ventured too close never came back. A ghost town, a town that had once been full of life, now only remembered in the whispers of those who dared speak of it in hushed tones, never too loud, for fear of attracting attention. And yet, despite the passing of time, there were still those who came. Not many, but a few. They were drawn by the stories, by the curiosity that gnawed at them from within. Some came to investigate, others to search for long-lost relatives. But none ever returned. The woods, thick with mist and twisted trees, held its secrets tight. The old cabin, still standing in its forgotten corner, looked abandoned, decayed by time. But it was never truly empty. Sometimes, if the night was still enough, you could hear the faintest sound, the soft creak of floorboards shifting under the weight of something unseen. The windows would fog over, then clear, revealing nothing. But the air in the town was always thick with the sense that something watched from the darkness. And sometimes at night, if you stood at the edge of the woods, you could hear them. The faint whispers, barely a murmur, but unmistakable. Join us. Forever? The voices carried on the wind, curling through the trees, weaving in and out of the branches like a lullaby from the other side. It was the same every time. The same call, a call that would always be waiting for those who were willing to listen. And though no one lived in the town anymore, it wasn't truly abandoned. Not completely, for the shadow of what had once been Emily still lingered, still waited. Her eyes, hollow and empty, never truly left the woods. her whispers echoing through the trees, calling for anyone lost enough to hear. The forest had claimed them all, those who had come looking for her, and those who came after. The town, the forest, the whispers, they were all connected, part of something old, something that could never be fully erased. And as long as the shadows stretched across the woods, as long as the whispers echoed through the trees, the town would never be free. It was a place lost to time, a place lost to the darkness. And Emily, the girl who had disappeared without a trace, was never truly gone. She was the forest now, and the forest was still waiting. Years passed, seasons changed, but the town remained locked in its silence. The earth had grown over the streets, vines curling through cracked pavement, trees pushing their way into the ruins of old homes. There were no more cars, no more voices, just the soft whisper of the wind, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig breaking under the weight of something unseen. Yet there were still people who came, just as curious, just as foolish. One by one, they would venture in. Each time, it was the same. The town seemed to welcome them, pulling them deeper into its grasp. The air would grow heavy. The sky, always gray, would darken even further. And then, the whispers would start. At first, it would seem like the wind, a soft rustle, a voice just barely heard, too far to make sense of. But then they would hear it again, clearer, closer, come closer. And as they walked deeper into the overgrown streets, they would begin to feel the eyes, watching them from the windows of old houses, from behind the trees, from the shadows. It was a presence, something ancient, pulling them forward, guiding them to the place they would never leave. The forest had claimed the town, yes, but there was something worse than just the land itself. It was what lay beneath, the very heart of the town, and the heart had been waiting. For Emily had not just disappeared, she had become a part of it. Her whispers, once soft and haunting, had grown louder, blending with the voices of all those who had come before. They were no longer separate. They were a collective, a single, unending call. And every time someone ventured in, they were drawn closer, until the ground beneath their feet seemed to move, pulling them down deeper into the earth. Some spoke of hearing their names, of seeing their faces reflected in the windows of long-abandoned homes. But they were always distorted, twisted, as though someone or something else was looking back at them. The last time anyone tried to leave the town, they said they saw something else. Something far worse than they had ever imagined. A shape, tall, distorted, dark. It stood at the edge of the woods, watching. It was Emily, but it wasn't. The face was her face, yet there was something wrong with it. Too pale, too empty. And then, as they turned to run, they heard the whispers again. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't a call. It was a command. You cannot leave. And that was the last time anyone set foot in that place. The town remained, a forgotten place on a map. No one bothered to visit. But sometimes if you stand at the edge of the woods, just at the border where the trees begin to thicken, you can hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling for those brave or foolish enough to listen. And though the town may be lost to the world, the forest is still there, waiting. The woods never stopped calling. Though the world around them moved on, the town remained trapped in time, frozen in the grip of something that refused to let go. And the whispers, they never faded. In fact, they grew louder. Sometimes, in the dead of night, travelers who passed by the forgotten edge of the forest would stop and shiver, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the trees, a strange urge to step into the darkness, even as their instincts screamed to turn back. It was as if the forest had tasted their fear and now waited patiently for someone else to stumble too close. And then, one evening, a small group of curious wanderers, Adventurers with no idea of the horrors that lay ahead made their way to the town. They had heard the stories, of course, the warnings, but curiosity has a way of blinding reason. They laughed as they crossed into the decaying streets, stepping past the ruins of homes long abandoned, marveling at the vines overtaking windows and doors. They were sure it was all exaggeration. After all, stories like this had always been about scaring children, didn't they? But as the night drew on, the air seemed to change. A thick fog rolled in, coating the ground like a blanket, muffling their footsteps. The buildings around them appeared even more grotesque, like they were sagging, waiting to collapse under the weight of the years. And then they heard it, a soft whisper, just at the edge of their hearing. At first, they thought it was the wind, but then it came again, closer, clearer. "Join us." The group froze. Their eyes darted to one another, and their laughter faltered. None of them spoke, but they all knew. They had heard it too, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, filling their ears, their minds. "Join us forever." The ground beneath their feet trembled. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees moving. It was something beneath them, something ancient and deep, waking from a long slumber. The fog thickened, swirling like a living thing, curling around their legs and pulling them in. In that moment, the town didn't just feel abandoned. It felt alive, as though the very earth around them was hungry, waiting for more. The lead wanderer, a young woman with a taste for adventure, started walking forward, her mind clouded by the whispers. It wasn't her decision anymore. It was the town's. She moved without thinking, toward the old cabin, the one that had once been Emily's prison, and the others followed silently, their bodies moving as though they too had lost their will. As they reached the cabin's door, it creaked open. No one had touched it, yet it opened as if it had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. But there, in the center of the room, was the crib. The same crib that had once belonged to Emily. But this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with shadows, twisting, writhing, as if something was trapped inside. And as they approached, the shadows seemed to reach for them, their cold, clammy hands brushing against their skin. Their breaths hitched. They turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. And then there was nothing. No escape. Just the whispers, and the shadows closing in, forever. And as they vanished into the dark, the town waited, still, hungry, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The night had swallowed the town whole, leaving nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the deep, pulsing silence that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The once vibrant streets, now choked by overgrown vines, felt like the tomb of a place long forgotten. And yet, the darkness here was not like any other. It had a presence, a weight. It was as though the town itself was alive, breathing in the cold night air, waiting for something. A soul to wander too close, a fool to venture too far. And then, as if answering a silent command, the forest stirred. From the trees emerged a shadow, thin serpentine, its form undulating through the mist. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring each step, each breath. It paused at the edge of the town, where the old road used to run, now a crumbling path leading nowhere. The shadow lingered there, watching, waiting, and then the whispers began, faint at first, almost imperceptible. But as the figure stepped further into the forgotten streets, the voices grew louder, filling the air like a tide, pulling everything toward them. The shadow stopped in front of what had once been the town square. There, in the middle of the square, a single figure stood, motionless, face turned to the sky. Her eyes were hollow, dark, endless voids. It was Emily, but not the Emily who had disappeared. She had been transformed, consumed by the darkness that had taken hold of the town. Her body was no longer human. It was something else now, something twisted, formed from the shadows themselves. And yet, there was still a trace of her left, a flicker of recognition in those empty eyes. "Join us," she whispered, and the shadow took another step forward. As it did, the ground beneath them cracked, the earth splitting wide, as though the very heart of the town was opening up to receive them. The whispers grew to a deafening roar. The shadow reached Emily, and without a word, the two figures merged. The town seemed to pulse, as if it had come alive again, a heartbeat rising from deep within the earth. And the town, no, the forest, would never be the same. It would keep waiting for the next soul to stumble in, and the cycle would repeat forever. As the darkness thickened, a strange stillness fell over the town, one that felt deeper than night itself. The fog that had rolled in with the shadow seemed to hang in the air like a heavy breath, pressing against the ruins of the town, suffocating everything in its path. In the heart of the town, the old cabin stood, its dilapidated frame barely holding together, a monument to the lost and forgotten. But it wasn't empty, not anymore. Inside, the shadows had taken shape, coiling and writhing with a life of their own. They were alive, breathing, whispering, pulling at the edges of reality. And at the center of it all was Emily, not as the girl who had once disappeared, but as something far darker, part of the very essence of the forest now. Her presence was the pulse of the town, the heartbeat that sustained its curse. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, some familiar, others unrecognizable, all trapped in the endless cycle. "Join us," they called, each voice pulling at the soul, urging the living to come closer, to step into the darkness where there was no return. And then the town fell quiet. It was not the silence of peace, but the stillness of inevitability. As the years passed, the town remained a forgotten memory on faded maps, a place that no one dared visit. It was no longer a town, it was a warning, a place suspended in time, where shadows lingered, waiting for the next curious soul, the next lost wanderer, the next whisperer to find their way into its grasp. But for those few who stood at the edge, staring into the woods, they felt it, the pull, the insistent beckoning. The whispers were always there, just beneath the wind, like an invitation to step forward, to surrender to the darkness that had claimed so many before. And so, the town endured, forever lost, forever waiting, as the cycle repeated. The curse, unbroken, unyielding, carried on through the ages, always reaching out for the next soul to listen. And the forest, Emily's forest, stood watch over it all, forever bound to the whispers that never ceased.